All right. Happy what day? Tuesday. I did actually look at the calendar to figure this out. Happy Tuesday, everybody. Every day is Blur's Day. We are back with another episode of Learning Tech Talks. And first of all, I want to give a big shout out to Intrepid today. They are the ones responsible for making this episode happen. If you're not familiar with them, definitely check them out. But I am joined by Matt Donovan, who is not from Intrepid. He's from GP Strategies. And we all worked together and said, you know what would be a really important topic to talk about is this big concept called the learning ecosystem that is all over the place. I feel like it's in almost every conversation I hear, but we're going to demystify that thing and dig into it. So I'm looking forward to the conversation we're about to have. This is going to be a fun one, I think. They all are, but this one's going to be especially fun. But before we get started, like we always do, as people start trickling in, let's warm people up. Let's get things going here. So if you can, if you're watching right now, comment in and tell me where you are in the world today. And we're going to do the same, starting with you, Matt.
So I am coming to you from Bloomington, Indiana. So just about an hour south of Indianapolis. So nestled in between Chicago, St. Louis, and Columbus, Ohio. So right here at the home of Indiana University.
There you go. Dab square in the middle of the U.S. You're like right in
crossroads of America. Yes.
And not too far from me, because I'm up in Waukesha, Wisconsin, up near Milwaukee. Not too far. It's not close. Not like I could fly my drone to your house or anything like that, but close enough that it would be less than a day's journey. We'll just leave it at that.
I have driven to Summerfest. I love it. So yeah. I love Summerfest. It's one of the best things ever. So.
All right. So now, before we get into the conversation, this is a nice little sidebar from the usual icebreaker. This one is completely off topic for today. And I was very enthusiastic with Matt's enthusiasm when I told him what the question was. So I'm really looking forward to hear this. And everybody who's watching, I actually would love to hear your answers to this as well. Let's get some strategy going around this. This has nothing to do with learning ecosystem, but it may come in handy at some point. So for you, Matt, you kick things off. But I want to hear, what would be your strategy for surviving a zombie apocalypse?
No, I love this. I love this because this is something that I've actually been thinking about. And I'm an old school zombie fan, so I get, the Walking Dead and all that here recently. But I've been thinking about zombie strategies.
You were thinking about zombies before the Walking Dead was a big thing.
I'm literally one go bag away from being ready to go. I mean, we're set. So, first of all, I am a recovering instructional designer at heart. So, the first thing we've got to do is find our location and our structure. We got to figure out where we're going to hole up to survive the zombie attack. So let's assume it's more of a short-term thing and not forever. That's where I'm more focused on right now.
All right.
The first thing is you got to get a structure, something you can board up, something you can, a couple of entries and out that. So you got to find a good structure. Then you got to select the people you're going to be with. Now, this is important. Every day I meet somebody, I'm thinking in the back of my head, is this somebody I want to be?
Thinking in the back of his head when he meets you, he's like, would I want to? Nope. No,
exactly. It's a personal network. It's like, okay, who would I put on in charge of, like in our zombie team? Who's going to be watching the back door? Yep. Who's going to be sharpening sticks? Who's going to be covering, things like that. And then how do you manage the one person that comes up with the great ideas? Like, let's set them on fire. And I'm like, that's a bad idea. It sounds like a good idea. Now you got a zombie on fire rolling around. These are things you got to think about first. No narcolepsy. First rule, no narcolepsy. Almost every time you put the narcolepsy on the back door, they fall asleep, doors open, zombies get in. So you got to make sure you have an alert crew. Having a barista would not probably be a bad thing. Keep us caffeinated throughout it. So I've started to think about who you assemble for your team, where you're going to be, and then you got to start to look at everyday implements that you can quickly turn into actual weapons. So
practical
weapon
stuff.
Creation, absolutely. It's I look at everything around my house as a way to probably kill a zombie if I had to. So I love your question.
Every meeting you have with someone where you're scoping them out for, would you be someone in my post-apocalyptic network? You're also looking at everything in your house, deciding, could I use this as a weapon?
Wherever we're at, we're out at a diner for dinner. I'm looking around just in case it happens. Where's my exit?
Head on a swivel.
Who am I picking with me? That's right. Always. You never know when it's going to hit. You got to be ready. These are the kind of things that I'm thinking through. And yeah, I mean, it's not a bad way to look at, somebody and say, look, I would be willing to be trapped in a house with you during a zombie attack. That's actually a pretty high compliment. If it's getting down to it, there's a lot of trust.
That's a fair point. You know what? Your answer to that was far more detailed, although not surprising. Not surprising, but more detailed than I expected. So the question, what's funny about this, the question was actually inspired. My wife and I have been watching, and again, I've kind of always been interested in zombie movies. They were fun, but we got really big into Walking Dead, even through the bad season, right? There were a couple bad seasons. You're like, I don't know if I can keep going. Then it came back. And we just started catching up on season 10. So this is it. Now, my response to this one is I've got 5 kids, 10 and under. We're not going anywhere, right? Like the whole idea, like we can't go anywhere without a zombie apocalypse. It just doesn't happen. We would be that injured, deer in the back of the herd. We would just be a sitting duck. So for us, it would be, how are we going to bunker down? Now, we are pretty strategically placed. We're on top of a hill. We've got good vantage points. So I think we could probably seal off and probably be okay here for a while. I'd probably need to fortify the compound a bit, but that's probably our strategy. See how long we can hold out.
You're not near a cemetery, are you? Because that's the other thing when buying property. Don't run into a house next to a cemetery.
My parents were funeral directors. I learned that at a very young age. That is not where we would be buying property. So see, I did debate this. I was like, would I go out into the middle of nowhere where potentially, right, you might be able to kind of set up your own thing, but then coming back, like, what if you need something? Do you really want to traverse hundreds of miles to find? I don't know, but you also don't want to be in downtown. I don't know. Lots to think about. Lots of important details to think about. Hopefully everybody now is better prepared for the zombie apocalypse based on this. And that's a perfect transition for prepping, because we're also talking about prepping for your digital learning ecosystem, which is as critical, if not more critical, in our success in organizations today. So with that, let me first, before we get even into that, why don't you tell me and everybody else just a little bit of your background? You said you're a recovering instructional designer. So lay that out for me. Give me your elevator speech if somebody says,
sure. Absolutely. So classically trained instructional designer from Indiana University here. So I came out and I said, this is what I want to do. I was actually looking at K through 12, but I decided adult is really where I wanted to go. So I got my graduate master's program there. I got into working with a local employer around here, doing some work with them. Loved what I was doing. Then I had the opportunity to pick up with a .com in the late 90s called Unex.com, which was a fantastic opportunity to really think about, if you look at that around the usability or the evolution of platforms at that time, which is very similar to what we're seeing now, the ability to think about how could you create as rich an online MBA program next to being able to go to there. So this was, $250 million venture capital to figure out that solution, partnering with Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, Columbia, and all of those folks. So anyway, really crafted that new forward thinking of how do we use platforms and technology, but really coming from a usability and a user side. So as I've kind of gone with that classically trained instructional designer to really go from content centric to almost a learner centric, wrapping around the content, that's kind of where
beyond just the development of the content itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're recovering instructional designer is that we're kind of overcoming
the recovering part.
That's the recovering part. Yeah. There's a lot of power when you think about designing a course. We start off with those learning objectives. It says at the end of this course, you will know. But in today's world, we're inviting them in, the learners owning the journey. And I, as a control enthusiast, as a classical designer, I'm crafting this thing that you will experience. I'm creating this for you, and you will experience it as I've designed it. You're now opening up the design to allow them into it to be able to craft and do that. That's that other. How do you open up that control side? So anyway, that's
it's
two
definitely
elements.
a shift, and I think it's one that as an industry we've. I don't know no, I don't know. I do know we're not there yet. We're not there yet in terms of arriving, and I think we still have a long ways to go. But I've definitely seen some big strides in, like you said, kind of opening that up and saying we are not the bottleneck. We are not the gatekeepers of all these things. And how, to your point, do we invite in learners into that? Okay, so you go way back then for it. I don't often bump into folks that have that, because I was going to be a math teacher, so I went the K-12 route, then bounced out, but still kind of in that sense. All right, so then let's shift gears. Toby recommends we remove all learning objectives. So I've nothing excites people more than when they get into something and the first thing they see is, by the end of this, Bloom's taxonomy. I mean, I know me.
Love it.
That just gets me out of my chair. I will be able to describe, recite, and explain. Love it.
It just warms your heart. It's like a grandmother's hug. That's the way I've gotten all my learning. If I didn't have objectives, this can't be learning, right?
What I'm going to do? How do I know what I'm going to do? Anyway, okay, so let's we're going to get distracted.
We're going to get banned. I know. At this rate, we're going to get our designer cards revoked.
Yeah, I know. We're going to get in big trouble here. So let's shift gears to the ecosystem piece, because this is a big thing that I think a lot of people in our industry now are thinking about. They're talking about it. They're saying, hey, we need to build an ecosystem. We need to improve our ecosystem. We need to architect an ecosystem. And personally, in the conversations I've had with folks, depending on who you're talking to, that means a lot of different things. I think there are some general trends that you'll see, but there's a lot of variety in that. So when somebody says to you, or when I said, hey, let's talk about the learning ecosystem, how do you articulate that? What is your definition?
Well, and I think you have a really good point. There's a lot of ways in which I think people try to talk about it, but we're also running into the problem that the word ecosystem is used so much, it's actually lost meaning. It's almost becoming ubiquitous. It's everything and it's nothing at the same time.
Everything and nothing, all at once.
And I think we have certain terms like LXP, Learning Experience Platform, that it means so much that it means nothing at all. And we're running to kind of into that. So I know personally what I found that works well in ways that when I've talked about, I look at it from an organizational intent of saying that if we were going to put something out there for the benefit of learners, workers, performers, what is our organizational intent that we would want to bring into that? How would we think about doing this? So we know, for example, and I have a little map that I kind of use to talk about it, but the first layer is that we want to create a place where the learners always go when they need to learn something. So whatever the moment of need is, whatever the driver is, I got to start off and think about that. So you think of the utilitarian need for it. It's just a centralized place people come when they need to learn something. So where do I go? Where do I find it? That's the first step, and that's generally your front door. And that's either been historically like an LMS or a curated platform that would be out there, or sometimes people are creating dynamic HTML5 portals that they're overlaying all these other things. But that's just one functional layer. Then I have kind of what you talk about is the device, the ways in which they interact with them. So you think about my own device, a company supplied device, a laptop, a virtual headset, watches, whatever, knowing that we're going to interact and either contribute, consume, go in the flow with, you're going to do that in a variety of ways. So think about a layer there. And then I kind of go through and think about these different layers like that. Probably one of the most critical layers that we look at is how are you going to actually collect data to know that it's either working or how to improve. So it's either prove that what you've implemented is working or improve it as you're actually going through and it's functioning. So the measurement and analytics layer is absolutely an underpinning that we have to have in place. And it blends, looking not just at traditional learning metrics like, the traditional Kirkpatrick or, the model of the 1 through 4 or 1 through 5 if you're a Phillips follower. Really, it's extending into the business and even into the affordance of some of the tools. Like, for example, you get into adaptive learning data points you're going to bring in, or you're going to bring in experience, consumption, relevance, if you can try and track that. So how do you actually have an overall map that shows from a business impact all the way back to your implementation? How will you have the right data at the right points to answer your critical business needs around, as a learning intervention, do we meet that? So anyway, that's where I get into mapping out the structures. And then there's other dimensions where you think about the learning organization itself. How will it actually manage the assets? Where will you build it? Where will you deploy it? So I need bandwidth friendly. So am I going to have a media server that's going to be able to deliver out more higher bandwidth items? What does that delivery side look like? How are you going to manage the assets, like a digital asset manager, where you're doing your own policy? So it was kind of a longer answer to it, but that's kind of what sets up that picture.
And just so you know, the way I tend to have these conversation flows, you can interrupt me. I'll probably interrupt you because, hey, that's how we're going to do it. But I think some of the things you hit on that where I see people go south a little bit once in a while is they're focused on the platform, right? The platform or the category that they're seeing in the market, the LXP or the LMS or the micro learning platform, and thinking about it in that standpoint versus backing up behind that. And some of the things you hit on that I think are really important to focus on is, one, what are the actual capabilities that you're needing to do? Like, what do you as a function need to accomplish? Not what platform are you going to use to do it, but really actually peeling that back and saying, what are we actually trying to do here? Which, to your biggest point, is, well, part of the reason you're taking this digital is to have greater insight and visibility into that. So what is the data you're going to get out of that? So asking some of those fundamental questions is actually a better starting place to say, well, okay, rather than just going, what do we not have? And I kind of popped it into the screen for a second, but like, this is something I've done in the past where it's been about, hey, what do we as an operation need to be able to do? These are the different things. And I think the other thing, sometimes we're so focused on the end user side of it. L&D is a pretty complicated operation. There is some capability that we need within there. So really kind of dialing that back and saying, what are all the different things we need to do? So that then we can figure out what technology do we have? What do we not have? What data do we not have visibility in? Now we can actually start saying, okay, let's design a architecture of systems around that.
I think it's a great point. And it's funny because I do have, and let's say it's more complex than it's ever been. So it's not that all of a sudden we're not grasping this. I kind of refer to it as the appification of the industry has risen to the point that it's overwhelming. I mean, through our innovation kitchen at GP Strategies, we're currently monitoring 36 categories of platforms, and over those 36 categories, over 155 platforms, and they're constantly in a state of flux as they move from. So what it goes to show us how many and what they're out there. But unfortunately, to your point, asking what you're trying to get out of it is probably the most important thing. Because sometimes we start off with, I think I need this. And I use a lot of times it starts off with that.
I think we need this.
Well, it'd be like, and I use the example of like dinner. So let's say I was going to invite you over to this beautiful dinner. We're going to run 7-course meal. And I said, but here's the problem. I need to know what 4 utensils or place setting items you want. Well, they want a plate, a glass, I don't know, a fork maybe. Great. And then you come to the house and you find out I'm serving lobster, crab legs, and oysters. And all of a sudden it's like, well, these don't work for that. Well, the idea is saying, let's start off with what are you trying to achieve first? What's your outcomes? And then we work back to find the right tools or technologies that match that. And then that's the biggest thing is you want to start off with the outcomes and the experience you're trying to drive, then make your technology solutions. I know that sounds simple, but it's surprising.
Simple. It sounds simple, but to your point, and I think there's 2 things you hit on that are really important with that sometimes we tend to be pretty hard on ourselves, and sometimes for good reason. But in other parts, your point is true that the complexity of this has exponentially grown. It has exponentially grown. And this is not necessarily territory everybody has always been super comfortable with. So now we're being asked to architect this complicated technical infrastructure. And, for a long time, maybe the complexity of technology we had to deal with was an LMS. Well, which LMS do we need? And now it's, and what else might you need to supplement that? But to your point about the utensils piece, and where you'll see this play out is when you don't do that problem outcome approach first, that's when you end up with a glass and a spoon and things like that. And you go, well, now we need to force this to open a lobster. And then you're sitting there trying to open a lobster with a spoon and then complaining that the spoon doesn't work and saying, this spoon is a piece of trash. It doesn't work. I hate the spoon. The spoon is the most useless utensil in the kitchen. And you go, well, no, it's not actually. You're trying to use a spoon to shell a lobster, and it's not ever what it was really intended to do.
I mean, that is essentially, and folks often ask me, I said, well, can we do it with this platform? I said, it's like a lot of things, you can make anything fly if you throw it hard enough. And honestly, yes, I can open a lobster with a spoon. I probably have done it and looked like a fool while doing it. But yes, is it efficient? Is it what was intended for? No. But that's the question, is what's the affordance you're trying to get back to? Are there better decisions you can make over time? I mean, but it is even, that's a great example to start people thinking about that. But let's even get into, I had a great question. Somebody was asking me, so we're thinking about a video based coaching platform. So basically, I as a user upload a video, and I want other people to come in and weigh on it. I want to demonstrate something, a task or a skill, like a pitch or something like that. I put it out there. And they're asking me which one is the best platform to use. That's what we want. And I'm like, well, what are you trying to actually evaluate or do? And so, I know that in our looking, there are probably 4 really good platforms, and there's probably more than that before I'm really seeing it apply, but they all tackle the problem very differently.
Yes.
And so if you were using it to said, I really want robust to be able to do a lot of rotations and be able to send it out to, 55 people and get, for each of the uploads, everybody gets 5 or 6. There's a really great, robust peer-based review engine. That's probably the strength of one. I have another one that's driven out of the timeline. So if I'm trying to highlight, like when you did this, like a vehicle walk around, or you showed this on a product, I could stop there, highlight on screen, and be able to show that. Again, it gets back to what are you trying to do to achieve for it? And it's not that both can't do it, but if you're trying to achieve this, I would recommend this one. If you're trying to do that, I might go over here. So,
and I think that piece of going beneath, the capabilities or the use cases, we're not just talking about surface level video feedback. We want video feedback. Well, okay, but there's nuance in that, and there's nuance between that, and saying, well, what does that look like? Going back to the learner centric side of everything, is what does that need to look like? Or ideally, what would you like that to look like on their end? Because based on those capabilities, which are bigger than just, we want a video feedback type platform, you're actually going into, well, this is where the workers are, or this is a typical workflow type thing. Okay, well, based on that, that's going to be a different pathway. And I think that helps with some of the things, because one of the other questions I get a fair amount is, okay, well, but do we need a separate platform because maybe this platform already does this? And I feel like as the platforms are getting more mature, they are baking in some more basic level functionality for some of these things. And that's where this can get you in big trouble with IT or into a battle with them if you haven't gone to that deeper level of what capability and requirements do you really need. On an RFP, the answer is going to be yes across the board. You're going to say, well, our LMS already does that. And it's going to be very hard to defend, well, actually, we need more than what our LMS can do because we have these specific use cases or this capability that requires a specialized tool that can do it like this.
And when it gets to engagement and adoption, and again, going back to that user-centric, that human-centric viewpoint, in the end, we need to really treat learning as an experience, and a dimension of that is them as a user of it. And so you have to get to the other end and think about, because if it says, that's fine, we're going to throw it out there, and you're surprised when they don't use it or it doesn't work well and you don't even get engagement and adoption, you may have gone with something you currently have, but did you really achieve your outcomes? Whereas maybe you look at your profile and said, okay, look for, because a lot of these are now cloud-based platforms, they have a range of structures that you can be able to work with them. One size fits all probably doesn't exist anymore. It just doesn't to meet all your needs. So the question is, and then I do know partners that actually maintain a couple of these tools, because every organization has different users. I have sales, I have in the commercialization side, I have manufacturing, I have R&D, I have corporate and general administrative. So I have different user groups that may do things, and they actually may need. But that's where you get into thinking about what are you trying to achieve? Can we do it with the same tool? Do we need to look at slightly different that's going to give you better lift? Because in the end, if you're going to make $1 of investment, you better get everything you can out of that dollar. Yeah. Making a dollar investment that you get no utilization of is a wasted dollar.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's where there is this natural tendency, and I get it. There's this natural tendency to say, well, can't we just make it easy? Can't we just have the one that does it all? And yeah, in an ideal world, that'd be great. But honestly, I actually don't think you would want that anyway. Because if you really think about it, if you told me, hey, do you want a phone that only has one app on it? No,
No.
no, I do not, because I don't want to have to use one app and try and figure out how to do everything with it. I actually want different things for the different things I'm trying to accomplish. And I think that's where, in theory, the concept of, well, wouldn't it be great if we just had one thing to do it all sounds good. But I would say in the end, it wouldn't. Now, a question that came up from Toby, and this is a good one, is, so Toby had asked, and I've been on both sides of this. Not everybody has the privilege of starting from scratch. So you may be in an organization where you go, yeah, this is great, and I would love to just go out and buy best in breed of all these different capabilities and work through that and build out my ideal ecosystem. I've been on the other side where you're handed a crap sandwich and you're like, well, we got to make this work. And I think for me, and I'm curious your take on this, one of the things I've found over the years is that a lot of times there's a perception that we need another platform, and we haven't really tested and maximized the capability that we have. There's this idea that, well, if we go get this one or this one, it'll be better. And we haven't really we haven't cleaned house internally. And so then all that ends up happening, you have this really nice, brand new, shiny Ferrari. You haven't even figured out how to drive a stick yet. So I think for me, my experience has been, well, let's figure out and actually maximize what we have, because that then further helps you articulate where the capability gaps exist. And you can actually have a quantitative discussion saying, hey, we're doing this. This is what we can get. We're maximizing this. If we could go this way, here's what we could get in return. And that then opens the dialogue to say, oh, you know what? Going back to your point of, if we're going to invest $1, let's make sure it counts. You can actually tell that story pretty well in that case.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing is there's two dimensions in this. And one is why I always advocate starting off with a map of the ecosystem. And so that's why kind of the structure of the org-centric utility standpoint, like, let's just map our current state, and you start to look at it over time where you want to go or what you want to be able to add. By no means of all the boxes that we have in there, no organization has everything. The question is you start to put in a 3-year projection of where do you want to go? What kind of features do you feel you want to have? Now, that's one dimension, is having a map and a plan. And there's no harm in actually coming up with, this is where we would like to go. That's visioning. That starts the cornerstone of a strategy of where you want to go. And that's a great place to begin the conversation. Now, the second thing is putting in a good innovation engine into the organization. What I'm really trying to get to is a proactive, evidence-based approach to learn about the platforms or that you want to explore that you may want to use, so that when you go to talk about adding this in, you've actually got data, high likelihood it may succeed, things like that, to be able to come in. Here, we actually know how it's functioned. We've tried this and we've tried this. We think this makes a lot more sense. I think one of the more challenging things I've seen is when you have like these mission critical business initiatives out there. So we're going to change our performance management architecture. We're going to roll out a new software to be able to help that. So we're going to decouple salary from, improving. So we want more robust performance conversations. We'll separate out salary and progressions, and we got to have a software to support that. And because we got all this, and it's very important, it's got everybody's eye looking at it. Let's try new technology.
Yeah, let's throw a new platform into the mix too. We still don't know how this is all going to work, but let's also layer on the complexity of a whole new system.
And we have no idea. I mean, that is the worst point. And this is the thing: innovation and execution, the way we think about execution, are often at odds with each other. Execution is consistent, systematic, repeatable success. Yep. Innovation is messy, risk-laden. You want to fail, but you want to fail forward, but it has a process with it. But innovating at the point of desired execution is a bad mix. So imagine if you were to go back 6 months, you had a separated space in the innovation where you were able to set up that test so that when this big initiative came out, guess what? I think we have a high likelihood it's going to succeed. This is a perfect application for that. And now we can get some traction. You now have a tested asset versus like, I have no idea what's happening. I can't get in. I can't get my modules on my phone. I can't do this. I can't do that. It didn't really work.
And now the whole thing falling apart looks like it's your fault, right? And it falls back. And I think a good example of this from my my history was back when DAPs, digital adoption platforms, were first kind of making their way onto the stage. this was one of those things that, and I've always called it my incubator. That's what it was. It was like the incubate. You don't do this in the midst of a mission critical thing. You do this as an ongoing piece that you're exploring, testing capabilities, testing this stuff out. And it was a similar experience where we had been playing around with DAPs for a bit, knew what the implications of implementing one were. We knew what the resource requirements were, what kind of workload it was going to take. And then there was a big mission critical business initiative. But by the time we said, hey, I think we can approach this differently, and here's what it was, we'd worked through a good chunk of what needed to be done. So by the time we actually rolled it out, we weren't scrambling, and it actually made it a wild success versus a nightmare.
Yeah, and I think that's key. And underpinning all of this, to level set any of your strategic, persuasive conversations, the more evidence you have to support it, the better off you're going to be. And that's where I think, even if, one of the things we did at GP was we really started to do what we called the innovation kitchen. So what that was, when our partners wanted to try something out, we actually had it on a GP side. So we had low risk, low barrier test and learn strategies. So we didn't have to penetrate a highly secure environment just to figure out, how does this platform work? Because most of these things, adaptive learning, you take it like an Intrepid platform, they are different experience profiles. They're if you've not been in one, you won't know what it's like till you've actually done it. It's a lot like grabbing a cat by the tail. It's hard to describe it. You just need to do it once and figure out this is not something you want to do again. That's the idea, is when you get into a safe environment to be able to do that, so you can gather data, you're going to ask some questions, the good old fashioned 7th grade, scientific process. Have I hypothesis? Ask some questions. You're going to learn some stuff, and you're going to try some more. Do it quick. Start more progressively, and then as you build confidence, as it goes from the art of the possible to, as I call, the business of the Bible, you're moving into pilots and bigger pieces, and it's ready to go. You're gathering evidence. Then you can really look at like price profiles, utilization. Here's where we can get some consolidation off things. All that starts to play in, and it makes it just a lot easier for that integration conversation.
And I think what you're talking about is especially critical for people in our field right now, because like we said earlier, this is newer territory for a lot of folks. The whole technical side of system architecture, IT integration, all this stuff is not developing e-learning courses or building a leadership development program. This can get pretty technical pretty quick. And I think, to your point, you don't want to be having those conversations with IT as you're in the process of this, and they're asking you about, well, what kind of integration requirements are you going to have? Or how is the data managed and stored on servers? Or as we're dealing with GDPR, where do you actually house this data? And what is your process for it? You don't want to be having those conversations when you've got a deadline 6 weeks out and you're trying to get through this thing, and works councils now are breathing down your neck going, yeah, you can't do this. And now that's becoming an issue. And I think that's, to your point, why it's so important to be exploring this stuff and doing some small scale pilots with some of these different tools to say, hey, how does this work? What's the experience? Where are we going to get some additional horsepower out of it?
Well, and you also get a nice insights into the cultural change your organization is going to have to do. The biggest part with most of these platforms where learning becomes an experience is a cultural shift. So one of the big tenets of modern learning is out there is I call it the first rule of modern learning, is that the learner must take accountability for the journey. They have a role, and this is a design shift for us. We start to create negative space in the design where the learners step in. They have to be that critical component for relevance to actually be achieved. The learners themselves complete that equation. I cannot design relevance for you. I can create the conditions for it. I can be highly likelihood knowing that it may be relevant to you, but as a consumer in the end, you're the one that makes that relevance, and you have a part and a role within this. And when we get into that, for any organization, when you take more of that ownership, and you've just been a consumer, but now I'm a collaborator, contributor, a moderator, pick the other oars that fit in there. How will you actually, as an organization, shift and adopt and take part of that? If you do your testing early, you will get insights into what the change management effort's going to need to be, because you have to plan. You cannot just, and we've seen this, some very well-intentioned, it's a rollout of a very powerful system. Some partners have looked at like, hey, we're going to pull out a curation platform, very powerful platform, but it changes the dynamics, a very pull-based piece versus push. when you do that, that's a big shift for the organization. And you really have to think about how you're going to actually drive that adoption, engagement, buy-in, and their role in learning. And the more you can get into that before you have to go live with it, the better prepared you will be when you actually need to launch it.
And on top of that is the fact that this type of stuff, I think back to a conversation I had a couple of weeks ago where with major scale digital transformation, sometimes the tendency is to say, we've got this one shot, we've got this one chance, and let's bet all our chips. We're all in on this. This is going to be it. And then we wonder why it goes down, in a ball of flames, because you can't play this like the poker table. That's not the best way to play this. The best way to play this is make strategic, conservative bets on small scale things and experiment, to your point of getting data, figuring out what are those implications on the change management side of things, all these other pieces, so that instead of, because I've seen this happen more times than once, is a new platform comes in and people have expectations of what it's going to do. You've bet all your chips on this. And because you weren't ready for it, it actually works against some of the major changes you're trying to drive, because people look at it and go, well, see, that doesn't work. And it's like, it does work, but it was the execution and implementation of that actually led to that conclusion.
Absolutely. And I think that's the critical thing when you're thinking about these. It's not just like, using a technology to drive change is probably not your best leverage point. It often comes with it. It's part of the process, but it shouldn't be just, we'll do it and they will adjust. That's a pretty bumpy approach to be able to do it. So, and whenever at all possible, what we're trying to say is get ahead of the game. Change the rules. We don't have to sit and wait for something to be launched. You can be proactive and you can be chewing these things up in advance so that when you get the call and it's ready, you can make the most of it. And then you probably don't even have to go in and do big bang, because you probably got strategic insights. You've been setting the groundwork. You're going to be a little bit better off. There are reasons why, and some conditions why you may have to go big bang. I personally, from a change management strategy for a lot of these things, I do not recommend big bang. It's a hard thing to change every element of the organization, and no one size fits all change strategy works for all the different functions within a business. They run at different business rhythms. So it's almost taking a customer centricity model and thinking about your internal customers of consuming a learner experience, and how do you adjust your approach so it meets the needs of what you know about that business function, that business unit, how it's going to respond and react. They're very different engines. You have salespeople will be very different than your engineers, will be different than your manufacturing SMEs. They're all going to be different populations that run at different speeds. And so how do we best get the most out of them in the new tool?
Now, the one thing and again, we'll see, maybe we'll argue, maybe we're saying the same thing and we'll go back and forth. It's always fun when there's a little bit of discourse in this one. So the one where I would say that I've seen some variant in this is when you look at, and Toby asked about this, with some of these large scale enterprise implementations. This is where I've seen the small kind of incubator approach not always work the best, right? And what I mean by that is, the incubator approach can work well for a capability testing where you say, hey, we maybe want to test to see how this would work, or what we need to know, or how we might want to integrate in with our system so we can get a feel for it. But when it comes to actually rolling this out to people, we don't necessarily want to gate or stage this thing.
No.
Because we actually don't want, and where I've seen this actually go really south is I won't mention where, but I had a wildly successful pilot that the business wanted to just take function by function by function by function. And we actually destroyed the momentum that we had, because word got out. It was really successful. Word got out. Everybody wanted it. And we kept having to tell people, no, well, you can't have it. Oh, no, it's not ready. You're not on the pilot list. And actually the whole initiative just went south. Now, going back a second time, the way we approached it was we said, let's unlock the capability for the enterprise, but we will be strategic in our rollout and kind of personalization plan. So we're not going to do hey, we're telling everybody all at once. We're going to personalize that, but we don't want the capability to be unlocked. And that's a different conversation with the business.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think you have a really good point. No, I would agree with you. And I think in the context of saying, are we going to go 0 to 100,000 employees within 12 weeks? And I'm like, that's a bit much.
It's a recipe for disaster.
That is going to be, but to your point, having it available and then having your strategic, that's what I think you really hit a fine point on that. So yes, there are thresholds where you do need to get those adoption levels and things working out. And you also do strategically think about who you're going to target in your rollouts. You want to build some momentums. You want to get some good wins. You want to build confidence in the system. You want to be able to do those things. Those are all absolutely critical. But I've also seen folks try and turn it on for everybody and then not have the right content to use in it. Because when you think about something that goes from learner and relevance driven, it's not just that I could turn it on and go into it. It's did I get what I needed out of it?
Was there something of value to me that brings
exactly?
And that is an important point, because you can lose your audience real quick if they go there and go, oh, this is this new thing. Useless. And then they move on, and it's very hard to get people to come back. So it is. And I think this is some of the complexity that we're talking about with this, that there's not a nice one size fits all. Here's how to roll out a new capability, because I just think the example we just talked through, some of those nuances depend on what kind of capability or audience or problem are you trying to solve with this? I think some of the smaller scale ones are great ones. And again, we're mentioning them because they're part of it, but not just for this reason. But you think of like an Intrepid, where you might say, hey, you know what? This is a different way of deploying a learning experience. Let's not necessarily make everything that, but let's figure out what this kind of capability, this is a different experience for learners to have. Let's figure out what we might be able to do with the program and see what that response is, so that we can then maybe potentially scale it up. That's a different story than saying, well, we've got an enterprise LXP or something like that, where we're going, well, we need everybody to have this kind of stuff. Let's pilot it with 30 people and see what they think. Well, that's going to be a different conversation.
And I think actually what you're bringing up is something that is seemingly a little bit of a conundrum. We talked about how more complex it's becoming, more sophisticated, but actually it's easier to set these platforms up than it ever has been, depending on the platform, depending on who you talk about, all those caveats. But I will tell you that it used to be when you were on-prem, primarily on-prem services, you actually were loading the software on a server, setting it up, doing all that, far more complex. A lot of the cloud-based platforms have made it easier to get up and running, which is good, because a lot of the platforms have really been thinking about how do we do that in a safe, secure manner, being able to do it. That is the part. So what you're offsetting is the energy between it. We used to have all this energy trying to just get the configurations right and get it all that. You still have a smaller window of that, but this one's now saying we have got, the programming set. I mean, it's like me and my television. Getting the cable to my house is one thing. Getting programming that I want to watch is a whole nother bucket. And that's it. You got to have both to get the end value out of it. It's without the cable, the programming doesn't matter. Without the programming, the cable itself doesn't matter. So the journey is complete it really is never complete, but it's
never complete.
Or fair enough. Yeah. It's never complete. I know that sounds terrifying to folks, but it's not like,
I think it's exciting though, right?
It is.
I think that's a little bit of a mindset shift that can actually make this go from overwhelming and to exciting, is the fact that, yes, if you're looking at this, what's the thing that we just need to do so we can be done with it and move on? You might look at this and go, well, to do this well, that journey's never over, because guess what? Even by the time you're done with some of the stuff, there's probably going to be new capabilities and new things out there that you go, oh, well, now we got to factor that in. That wasn't even a thing we were thinking about 3-4 years ago. And now we've got to figure out how to account for this and things like that.
Absolutely. And I think that's where the new complexities come into, because in the end game is utilization, engagement, and even pulling them in a less transactional manner. That we often rely on them being the contributors, being the sharers, the evaluators, through micro evaluation, whatever it is, smaller chunks of these, but we actually integrate them more than we ever have. That's the real game, to be able to do that. And it's just enough. That's the other thing, is it's just enough. This isn't, you don't want them spending forever in it. I want them to spend no more time than they need to get what they need, but no less either. So it is a sweet spot in the middle of really trying to get them a little more open architecture, a little more open access with the right drives and the motivations. They can get what they need for the right moment of learning need, and then get back to where they're at. So being able to put it next to them. So
what's funny about you saying that, though, talking earlier about your recovering instructional designer piece, that what you just said right there is a fundamental shift that you have to make, because historically, and I grew up in the space too, there's this natural attachment that we get to our stuff. We make these programs, we make this content, we design all this stuff. It becomes very personal for us. And the risk we can run into is going, well, but I want to make sure that they do it all. They have to see it all. They have to do everything that we dedicated and designed, versus saying, actually, what we care about is that they get what they need out of that. And what they need out of it may be a little bit different than somebody else. And we need to be okay with saying, well, if you got, I think back on MOOCs, back when MOOCs first came out, they got a pretty bad rap because, oh, well, completion rates were only here. Yeah. Well, yes, because you were looking at completion rates as your success metric. But when they actually went back and then assessed users and said, did you get out of the course what you needed? Well, that metric was through the roof, because that's really what people were going there for. Well, I went into this course, I really only needed this. I got that out of section this, and that's all I needed. And so I went on. Yeah.
That's a great point. And I think that's creating that space for that to happen. And I'm not saying that as designers, we all abandon all intent in our designs. That's not what we're saying.
Absolutely not.
But you're creating space that I said, I have these key outcomes that I am designing with intentionality. I mean, take it out of the learning context. If I go into a museum, they have assembled the pieces of art on the wall for a reason. There's an intentionality within this room why these pieces are here. Now, when I'm in that room, there's space for me as an individual and a consumer of the experience to walk out with my own impression, my own rationale for why things were there and what I took from it. I can take what they had in intentionality and I can have that. And that's part of that, being able to open up to that kind of experience to say, what are you trying to get out of this? And that's the beauty of it, is when they actually got what they needed in unexpected ways. Oh, those are actually the hidden gems of a new designing experience that was really, and I'll tell you, I got broken early on as an instructional designer, because I had the opportunity to watch we had the blessing of a 10-bay usability lab. So we were designing online MBA courses. So we bring in learners, we paid them. It was a .com, so money wasn't the problem. Spend was actually the strategy. So we brought people in, and these are college level accreditation courses, and we had a camera on the learners, a camera on their experience, and then a room where we had usability associates actually watching the experience the entire time. So as an instructional designer, I'm allowed to come and watch what I've just designed. So these are like 40-hour experiences that include facilitator feedback. So these are extended experiences, and of course, I'm all of a sudden questioning the sample, because clearly you did not, my design is impeccable. The users themselves are the wrong solution, because my design is solid. What I began to realize is in the debriefs, and it was constantly like, I could sit in the room while the associate was debriefing, but I couldn't talk, because I'm sitting here and they're looking at space like, said, you got to stop with the faces, you got to stop with this, and open yourself up to why did they not? And they were like, well, when I looked at this, and all of a sudden I had to open myself up to the fact that I had a design bias. Yep. I am probably, every moment I spent designing something, I am naturally building a bias for how I think it should go. Yeah. The usability of it by bringing in the right people helps wring that bias out. And nothing's more exhilarating than going, I didn't see that coming. Yep. But let's talk a little bit more about that. So,
and that's a mindset shift. And I think that's the thing that really, but it's an important point to make. And I think, there's a couple things, because this happens true with system architecture. It's this comfort with failure. There's going to be times you're going to pick a platform and you're going to go, I think this is going to dramatically change the end user experience, and people are they're going to throw me a party because it's going to be the best thing ever. And you're going to do it, and people are going to go, I hate it. I remember I was with one organization and we dramatically transformed. I was excited. I thought it was going to be great. And the response was, give us back the PDFs. And I remember being like, what? Like, what did you just say? Do you not understand the beauty of the art, the architecture behind this? And then you had to kind of go, well, you know what though? I'm not here for me. I'm here for them. And that doesn't mean you can't push or you can't try and do that. But that comfort was saying, well, okay, we're going to try some things. we're going to get knocked in the teeth, and some things are going to fail and some things are going to work. But again, it doesn't go back to just throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, just forget it. Don't worry about it, because it's about really mastering that skill of how do we architect the entire design. And while we knocked a little bit on learning objectives in the beginning, that is why that outcome focus is so important, to say we need to get the person from point A to point B. Let's design the experience around that regardless of who you are, you can make a successful journey. Your pathway through that is going to look dynamically different, but let's not get hung up on making sure that you take the path that I thought you should take and say, did we get you here to here? And did you find value in the architecture that we built?
Yeah. And what's getting them within that, now you have a more complexity because you get things like data thresholds. Yes. You get community buildups. And these are all things that, first you got to get open with testing and feedback and the risk of failure. Then you master the art of failing brilliantly. You're looking really good while failing because you learned and changed and adopted. So that's good. And I mean, a lot of us, there's a lot of us in many professions that struggle with this, but I think designers, deal with perfection challenges. So that whole failing brilliantly is is something we've got to do. But yeah, it's getting into that. But now it's like thinking about how you run into dimensions of how do I run a test so I can get thresholds of participation, thresholds of community, so that they get an authentic experience without actually having to run the whole system. So you do need to get a little smarter about that. But that's where I think you start to look at things coming in, and when you're relying on them taking, that's the exhilarating thing, because I'm going to tell you, things are changing too fast. Our competitive environments are too complex for an organization to sit down and figure out the solution and roll out the answer for everybody else, because by the time they've done that, the question has changed to something else, and it's too late. We now need to bring in the workers and the performers and the learners as part of our ecosystem, and they become much more powerful in helping us adjust quicker and faster. And the platforms we have, it's not just that I created all the content for you, I created the structure. I used to tell a story about, I put up this picture and I would show, does anybody know what this is? And technically it was a man-made reef. So people didn't know what it was. I said, this is my instructional design shift. I no longer focus on creating the reef. I create the conditions for the reef. The idea is to say life will happen. And then the first layer and the second layer and the third layer, you have to pick the right places where it's going to be. But that's the idea, is to get this, because that's the only way it's going to sustain over time. Yeah. There are things we cannot build that we have to be able to get a much bigger, it's less direct, and it's a little more convoluted to figure out how you do that. But that's moving quickly along that progression to get to those bigger challenges is really where we need to get to.
So much good, so many good points in there that I'm looking forward to the transcript of this so that we can kind of highlight some of these, because there really is just so many things that I think people can take from this, and where I would continue to push us to continue to push the needle on this is not just in the innovation that we're doing on that end user experience side, but also when you look at, and I mentioned this before, is so often it's easy to get wrapped up in the end user experience. And that is an important component. I will say that is absolutely an important component. But the other piece is there's a lot of other, going back to the quick, I'll flash it up real quick. Going back to the other sides of the capability, there's a lot of other things that we can be focusing on to help improve the end user experience. And I think that's one of the things that's important when you're thinking about this ecosystem is, yes, be exploring the end user tools, the content delivery tools, the things like that. That's important. But also, if your house isn't in order and you're not using some of this technology to improve your internal efficiency or your internal operations or the way you design content from the fundamental, that standpoint, you're also missing opportunity to improve the end user experience. And I think that's one of the things where sometimes it can be easy to narrowly focus on, the ecosystem, that's where the front door for the learner. Not quite. It's part of it.
Yeah. Well, and that gets to the thing you're looking at. It's not just, do I have the right technology in place? It's how we design effectively for it. And you've got to have a really good design with the good, technology with the affordance you're looking for. But you also want to make sure it's secure and it's got a future mindset on how it's able to share data safely without having to port out usernames everywhere else. The scalability to actually not only collect data points today, but ones that you're going to have for tomorrow. So it's trying to get that architecture in place for growth on both dimensions. And that's the really exciting part, is that we have more. Right now, we fundamentally have had the first time in a long time the ability to do with designers what we've known we should be doing. The concept of spacing.
Yes.
I mean, we've known the problem about the forgetting curve for I don't know how long. And for how many years did we say a 2-day workshop is what I got to do, because it was based off of efficiency and what we can do.
Yep.
We now have opportunities to actually go with how we know people learn and do it. If we do it well, if we have the right technology and the right design, we can actually achieve the things that we have been frustrated with historically. So I think the question is, and for those designers out there thinking about this, is like, you're getting to the world of yes. What do I do with the yes when it's constantly been no? You don't have time. You don't have resources. You kind of got to go back into this. What do you do with the yes? Having those technologies, those ecosystems to be able to take advantage of it, but know how to design for it so that when you get that shot, you're really showing this is apples and oranges. You're able to show this is why it's so much better.
Yeah. Well, and that's, and you hit on that really important point. That is, it goes back to, I think sometimes we tend to beat up on the way things have been done and things like that. But in many regards, a lot of the things we've done were because we had bad intentions or we didn't want to do these things. There were truly physical, financial, resource limitations where it was like, well, we would love to do some of this stuff. We just can't, because we only have this window of time and this appetite for whatever. And now we have the long work, to your point, of saying, well, now we can say yes to some of this stuff. Now this idea of, wouldn't it be great if we could? Well, the answer is we can.
I mean, I love it, and we have an example of, like, we do some very great programs on the Intrepid platform, and here's the beautiful thing about this is now, because you can space, so it's time bound, but it's spaced over time. Here's the mind blowing part: is I can run a level 3 evaluation before I do my level 1. I can actually show proof of transfer before I ever ask you whether or not you like it. And I can actually, see whether you're transferring, because I have it overlapped over the work cycle. So I'm asking you and thinking, and you're learning and you're applying, and I ask you to bring it back. And as a group with peers and experts, we look at your application, and I saw that you did this, and I gave you feedback, and I saw how you try to implement it. I actually can collect through the natural course over time. I can do a level 3 evaluation
on the impact of this stuff before we even go through it, which is just, it was things that were not impossible, but logistically nearly impossible.
Why would I run a level 3 evaluation on something? So I'm going to go spend, tens of thousands of dollars to go figure out that my tens of $1,000 thing worked or didn't work, because it was, and you get anemic response rates. So level 3 was always really hard to do.
Yes.
I go, now it's actually more naturally. It's in the flow of work and learning where we're at it. And as we get even closer to the point of performance with the rise of the Office 365, we didn't even dig into that, but now you're just blowing past.
You run out of time.
I know. I knew it. I had a suspicion, but that's the stuff. And I'm like, all of a sudden it's like, I'm going to blow your mind. What if we could do a level 3 before level 1?
Yeah.
You can't do that. Oh yeah, you can.
Oh,
I mean, that's the beauty.
Yeah, and I think that's, we'll wrap here, but I think that's one of the encouraging, exciting parts about this whole digital ecosystem and all these new technologies and what you can do is, I use the word reimagine, which gets kind of thrown around a lot, kind of like ecosystem anymore. But really, when you think about it, it's the fact that it's, what would you do if you could do anything? Because the answer to that now is you can. You can. It's just a matter of figuring that out. And it's not as complicated or as difficult as it once was. And I think those opportunities, we should be excited about that. We should be hungry. We should be, getting really amped up about that, not fearing that as, well, this is dramatically different than what we've done before. This is going to be really uncomfortable. Yeah, it is. It is going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be a shift. You're going to have to change the way you do things, but it's much better on the other side.
Well, and I think to your point, it's not going back and saying that everything we've done in the past as designers has been bad or wrong.
No.
But I will say that the part here is that once you have the availability and you don't step forward, that's the future challenge, is when you fall back to old practices under old constraints and those are relieved for the future. That's the thing. Now you have the ability to step in and take advantage to new designs to be able to do things that we haven't been able to do. So I think the past was understood. It had a lot of context.
It is what it was.
Future, that's where I think our challenge goes. And that's going back to why I push myself as a recovering instructional designer, thinking differently. How do I embrace the yes after so many of no's or qualified no or whatever? It's how can we actually do some of the things we know we should be doing?
And concluding thoughts, I would say I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's probably the biggest risk we have now, is that if we discover that this is what's possible now and we refuse to do it because it's not what's comfortable for us, that's where the real risk lies. Because as digital acumen and the possibilities, as our stakeholders get smarter and smarter about what we can do, you don't want to be in a position where you go, we can't do that. And they're coming to you going, yes, you can. And I know you can. That's not a position that you want to be in.
Or let me show you how I just did it.
Let me show you how we did that. That's even worse. So, all right. Well, with that, again, big thanks to Intrepid for making this one happen. Thank you, Matt, for setting aside the time. Super fun conversation. Hopefully everybody got something of tremendous value out of it. And I wish you all the best. We will be back later this week. So have a good one, and we will talk to you on the other side, Matt.
Thanks.